This is Orlando Sentinel Now.
Hello, it's Friday, December 3rd. Rich Pope here with Kevin Spear, Amy Drew Thompson, and Patrick Connolly. Today they have our topics. Good ones today. We're going to take a parting look at a series on the environment and the outlook for the future of wildlife and preservation here in the state. Also, we're going to look at a prohibition drink that should be perfect for celebrating Repeal Day, and we're going to take a look at Florida fresh air to get out this weekend or anytime in the near future. But we're going to start here with Kevin. So, Kevin, you're coming to an end of a series that you've been working on about Florida's outlook on the environment, wildlife, and this is a tough one to get your hands around, and I think what's really nice, last time I spoke with you, you talked about an optimism to it, and I think that's a real nice fresh air for this. Tell us about the series.
Yeah, so the series is about events leading up to this rise of a strategy to save what's left of Florida's wilderness and wildlands in the face of development pressures that are coming. And so what this story is about is a hope for doing that. It's not yet a victory, but there is a hope that we can succeed in putting aside important habitats and saving critical wildlife, even as we add 10 million people to this state.
Yeah, so tell me about your lasting impressions as you come to an end of this.
You know, this was a 5-part series. It took several months to put together, and it was a kind of marathon to get it done. But as the stories have come out and I've been able to see them online and in print, it occurred to me that being mindful of Florida's environment, or an environmentalist, I'm a journalist, is to be in a kind of a constant state of mourning, of understanding that another loss is going to come, and we're sort of in this steady retreat from where we want to be, and it's a hard place to be. And it occurred to me that I have been really focused on the darkness of Florida's environment, and it was nice to see this story come along to give something to hang on to going forward. I stood in an important parcel called DeLuca Preserve, which is written about extensively in this story. It's way down south of Orlando. It's midway between South and Central Florida, and the saving of that property has been instrumental in all of this that I've written about. And it was supposed to have been turned into a city some years ago. And as I stood there in the middle of the night, stars and all of that, I just kept thinking of the bulldozers coming, and then that they didn't come really meant to me a turning point that should be acknowledged. And that's what this series of stories does.
Tell me about this Florida wildlife corridor
Yeah.
that you talk about in the story. And I'll tell you, I looked at the map on the story, and you see it taking place, and you can see like where, if you're an environmentalist, that you can see how close things possibly are to maybe actually making this a thing.
The Florida Wildlife Corridor is this notion that you have to take the state's environmental treasures, the big ones like Everglades National Park, and the small ones like Lake Louisa State Park, which is in your neighborhood, and Wekiwa Springs State Park, and hundreds of parcels across the state that have been saved through the just unrelenting efforts of environmentalists and government actors and all of that. But they're scattered across the state, and the Florida Wildlife Corridor movement would find ways to link all of those by protecting more landscapes for the movement of wildlife, for strengthening what's in place today. That's the notion of it, and that's been on the rise. The thinking behind that has been on the rise for the past 2 or 3 decades. What's happened more recently has been really important. The Florida legislature this year approved $400 million to get that Florida Wildlife Corridor concept really moving in a forward direction.
Yeah, not to crush those hopes, but it even mentioned in the story, talked about how the development machine in Florida seems to be once again starting up.
Sure. I mean, that's never going to stop. The competing interests in this state are powerful. The development interests are powerful, and they're fed by people and money arriving from elsewhere, pouring into this state. So the development pressure on this state is going to be ceaseless, and there are going to be pitched battles everywhere. But at least now, with this notion of the Florida Wildlife Corridor movement, people have a way of thinking about how to go forward and what to save and what to let go, and where to arrive 50 years from now.
Right. As a reporter or journalist that's covered the environment for 30 years, how do you walk away from this? What's your final feeling, your final thoughts on it?
I have covered countless stories involving many different kinds of people, biologists, environmentalists, government people. And I guess I really never stepped back and thought about the overall sense of it. But the environmentalists involved in these stories that I've written, and I think it speaks to environmental issues broadly and always, the diversity is amazing. And I'll just give you a feel for that. One of the characters in the story is a guy by the name of Arnie Bellini. He's a wealthy dude who developed a tech company and sold it over in the Tampa Bay area. And he turned around. He says, "I'm going to do things that create more jobs, but to compensate for that economic growth, I'm going to do what I can to protect the environment." And he's invested $30 million in funding environmental efforts, but also in hiring the two top lobbying firms in the state to get the legislature to move in a positive direction for funding wildlife corridors. There's a woman in my stories from Mexico who grew up on a remote ranch and understood the importance of wildlife on her ranch, and that's her life now. And she's in Florida working on research of birds. And then finally, of the many characters, there's one that will always stick in my mind. She's the widow of Fred DeLuca, the guy who created Subway sandwiches a long time ago and became a billionaire. And he was the one who was going to create the city midway between Central and South Florida. It didn't happen. The Great Recession kind of put an end to that. But his family, he died in 2015. His family still had the land, and there was a lot of thought that that land would ultimately be developed. But the widow, Elizabeth DeLuca, who doesn't give interviews, ultimately donated that land to the University of Florida. And I'm stunned by the wonder and the magic of that. I mean, that's not something you could, as an environmentalist, ever want to make happen, but it did. And so it's the people involved that from this series are sticking in my mind.
That's awesome. Well, Kevin's series is up right now. Day 3 is up. It's going to go 5 parts, so finish up the last 2 in the coming days. But be sure to go check it out. Worthwhile. It's in the newspaper as well. Check it out there. Appreciate that, Kevin. All right, moving forward here, we're going to go to Amy Drew Thompson. So, Amy Drew, this is a Prohibition era whiskey drink, a rye drink called the Scofflaw that you went and looked at the history of it. Pretty interesting drink here.
Very fun. Repeal Day's coming up on the 5th. And it was fun to talk to Arthur Booth, who owns the Suffering Bastard Tiki Bar up in Sanford, because he is the biggest cocktail nerd, such a historian. I learn so much every time we talk. And most of the cocktails these days that are touted as Prohibition era aren't even Prohibition era. There are drinks that existed decades before, but then when Prohibition was repealed, the cocktails were reintroduced with sort of new current names that made them sound fun and funky. But they'd actually been around a real long time. The Scofflaw was actually created almost in response to Prohibition. It was making fun of Prohibition, and it was created by a bartender in Paris.
What I find interesting, though, too, the term Scofflaw wasn't originally meant to be a drink. It was essentially supposed to be the other way around, to make fun of individuals that were breaking the law and taking a drink.
Yes, there was a newspaper editor who was a big proponent of Prohibition, and he kind of challenged readers to come up with a name for people who sort of ignored the law, lawless drinkers, right? So actually, out of thousands of people, 2 submitted the same word, which was a combination of scoff and law, and there you have it. And it didn't take very long before the folks across the pond made a cocktail and called it that.
Yes. So tell me about this drink. I have to say I've never had one, but from what I understand from the story, it's a sour. Is that what it is?
It is. It's a bit of a take on a sour, on a whiskey sour. It uses rye, which is very American. Good old boys drinking whiskey and rye. Uses a pomegranate-based grenadine, which is what grenadine originally was back in the day before sort of food industrialization and bright red maraschino cherries and that kind of a thing. Some lemon juice and some dry vermouth, and it's strained into a coupe glass, and it's a lovely lighter take for whiskey drinkers. Not very well known. There's a bar in Chicago that's called the Scofflaw, and they obviously serve it. And it's a classic that Arthur says all the bartenders should have in their compendium for sure. I forgot the bitters. There's orange bitters in that drink too.
Yeah, Amy Drew, I just gotta get your take on this. I know Repeal Day is coming up. It's December 5th, and that was like essentially the end of Prohibition. Just your thoughts. Like, I can't believe Prohibition even happened. Like, do you think of this? It's like, this is crazy talk.
There were temperance movements in other countries, not just here. Florida was an interesting one because it was sort of kind of a wild, wild west down here. It was hard law to enforce. The government used to find stills out in the woods all the time. It was easy. You know, we have a lot of wilderness here, and people would get run in, and there were some famous speakeasies even in our own neighborhood. Maybe that's my next story then, digging into some history of the speakeasies around here in Orlando back then.
All right, well, good one there. You can read about the Scofflaw on OrlandoSentinel.com. Amy Drew does a good job laying that one out. We're going to go here to Patrick Connolly for Florida Fresh Air. And Patrick, you went out to Gemini Spring Park. Tell us about it.
So this park is just south of DeBary, managed by Volusia County, and it's called Gemini Springs. It has twin springs, so to speak, and you can see they have really nice maps there. And in general, I should say Volusia County parks have really nice interpretive displays to learn about the history and stuff. That certainly remains true at this park. Anyway, you can see on the map there's two different springs. Together, they discharge about 6 million gallons of water per day. So it's really nice. You can walk around the park and get a glimpse into these springs. You can't actually swim in them. In some research, I realized that the swimming has been closed for a number of years because of unsafe levels of bacteria in the springs. But still, it is a really nice park to walk around, get a glimpse at these springs, learn about some of the history there. It used to be farmland for a while, and before that, it was used by the native people who inhabited the land, you know, before any other settlers showed up. But in terms of modern day visitors, it's a great place to have a picnic. There's a number of pavilions that you can reserve. So, you know, walk around, you know, spend some time with friends and family, maybe have a little cookout. And there's also a large dog park there, about 4.5 acres in total. There's one for small dogs under 25 pounds and one for large dogs over 25 pounds. There's also a fishing pier where you can cast your rod into DeBary Creek. So that's an option if you have a freshwater fishing license. There's a canoe launch. It's a little ways from the parking lot. But really just a number of different activities you can explore there. A playground, you know, just a good place to go and spend an afternoon. You know, even if the swimming isn't allowed, you know, just a really serene place to sort of relax and, you know, get some time in the sun.
Yeah, in your story, you pointed out that there's actually camping sites there as well, but it looked like they were primitive sites, right?
They are. I believe they have a dozen or so primitive campsites, $15 a night. And, you know, they're a little bit off the beaten path, tent only. But you could actually make an overnight visit there if you want. I should mention there's also some horseback riding trails within the park, but biking, you know, skateboarding, rollerblading aren't allowed in the park. It's really best explored by foot. If you do want to get some more exploration in on paved trails on your bike or however, it does connect into the Spring to Spring Trail, which can take you over to Green Springs, which isn't too far away to the east. And I believe the trail isn't quite finished yet, but to the north, it's actually supposed to ultimately connect with the Leon Springs as well. So there are more options to explore beyond the park if you really want to make a day of it.
All right, good stuff there. You can go to OrlandoSentinel.com and read Florida Fresh Air. A lot of good features there from Patrick. Go ahead and take a look at that. But we're going to go ahead and call it quits for today. Appreciate you guys being with us. Also want to point out, go to OrlandoSentinel.com/subscribe and support our work. We always do appreciate that. But for us, we're going to call it quits. Until next time, I'm Rich, Kevin, Amy Drew, and Patrick. Everyone have a great day. We'll see you soon.
Watch Orlando Sentinel Now live every weekday at noon on our Facebook page and on OrlandoSentinel.com.